Silence is core to many spiritual practices: prayer, meditation, silent retreat. It's a way of life for mystics and monastics. For most of us, though, it is hard to find moments of silence, except perhaps when we're here at church. Our livelihoods and our families and all of the associated responsibilities require us to be engaged in the busyness of life. So how can we build on the silence that we experience in this sanctuary and have more of this sacred silence in the rest of our lives? To do so, we must develop a spiritual discipline that we can practice when we are not at church. A spiritual discipline that connects us to who we are, makes us feel loved, and transforms our relationship with the larger web of life of which we're a part. This was the challenge given to 5 people who were part of a BBC documentary series called The Big Silence. Now, unlike most reality shows, which have a constant soundtrack of talking and often a lot of arguing, this one had long periods of silence. Very unusual. The concept was 5 people attempt to put silence at the heart of their everyday lives and then learn what to do with it once it's there. The participants included John, a 55-year-old entrepreneur, twice divorced, who was anti-religion but felt that his life was missing something. David, a 28-year-old overworked restaurant manager with a fiance and a 1-year-old daughter. Helen, a 50-year-old workaholic who had lost her job as an HR director during the recession but was trying to figure out her next steps. Carrie, a 29-year-old working in advertising who considered herself religious but wanted to integrate her Christianity in a deeper way throughout her life. And then Trish, a 40-year-old teacher, radio DJ, and mother of 2 who had lost her faith when her father died. The 5 of these people were led by Father Christopher Jamieson, a Benedictine monk and abbot of Worth Abbey in West Sussex, England. In this 3-month experiment, it was a 3-month experiment to test whether this ancient monastic tradition of silence could become part of their modern lives. First, they went to Father Jamieson's monastery for a weekend to meet each other and to get acquainted with the spiritual disciplines that they would be practicing. They left their families and their jobs behind and dove deeply into silence. They were then sent to a Jesuit retreat center for 8 days of complete silence. They were not supposed to talk to anyone except to their spiritual guide for 1 hour a day and to themselves as they took selfie videos reflecting on the experience. All of them were challenged, but some felt that challenge more than others. On days 1 and 2, John and David huddled in the woods, smoking cigarettes, complaining about the food and the utter boredom of silence. But over time, the silence worked on them, as spiritual practices tend to do. The earth began to teach them that when everything seems dead, it later proves to be alive. A deadened, buried part of themselves began to come alive. These words from Pablo Neruda's poem that Jesse shared earlier describe so beautifully what spiritual practice does. It shows us that the parts of our lives that seem dead are actually alive. Through silence, these buried parts come alive and thrive. Now, the participants in the big silence realized through this experience, as Helen said, "Wow, there might be something in this." Those who came in saying that they had no faith in God left saying that they had heard God in the silence. As the verses from 1 Kings in the Hebrew Bible say, God was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but God was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. The initially resistant John, in reflecting back on his 8 days at the retreat center, said, "There's only one place to go in silence, and that's into yourself." Through silent introspection, you discover not only something about yourself, but you also find that still small voice of God, of love, of life itself, that points towards something beyond. In his Confessions, Augustine of Hippo, the Roman African father of the Christian church, contemplated a series of questions about this dynamic of introspection and connection with something beyond. And I paraphrase him. He wrote, "How can I call upon you, God, when by the very act of calling you, I would be calling you into myself? Is there any place within me for you? Even heaven and earth, can they contain you? Does everything that exists in some way contain you?" And he comes to realize, I would not exist if I were not in you or part of you, God. To what place can I call you since I am part of you? So Augustine goes inward seeking to discover God, but finds that he is in God already, and that the saving love that he seeks is already present. Like Augustine, when we allow ourselves to enter the place of silence within so that we can behold ourselves, we discover who we already are, where we already are, that we are held by a love much larger than us. We find life because we are alive, and we find a still small voice of love. I invite you now to find this love inside you by, as Augustine says, opening the ears of your heart. Will you join me in a moment of silence? When silence works on and in you, it changes you. Whether it's 12 seconds or 30 seconds or more, we become still and the silence that we've created permeates. Eventually, as Pablo Neruda suggests, all the activity and harm and violence around us might cease as well. Imagine. A spiritual practice of silence that I engage in quite often involves very simply turning off the radio in my car while I'm driving, particularly to and from church. I find that it helps me pay attention and listen and reflect in a way that I don't when I'm just going about my day. On my Sunday morning drive in particular, I often feel tired, not yet energized by the vibrancy of this community. I'm milling over my sermon and worried that some part of it won't sound right. I'm dwelling on something that happened that morning at home or the day before, or I'm thinking ahead to Sunday afternoon and all the things that I have to do. But the one thing that I'm not is present to my surroundings. And it's important that I be present on Sunday mornings to myself and to all of you. So I turn off the radio and I drive in silence. I notice the new flowers blooming or the brown, crispy tree limbs left from the storm in June. The eyes and ears of my heart open. I listen to my breathing and I feel myself get calmer. Sometimes I break the silence by singing, but the silence returns. I spend this time in silence so that as I enter church, I'm present and prepared to let this sacred place and the experience that we create together take me to a deeper level. And then as I leave church and get in my car, I leave the radio off. I don't want anything to drown out the experience that I carry with me from the morning. I drive home again, noticing and listening to my surroundings, but also contemplating my gratitude for this church and for you and for the morning together. The silence helps me to bring that spirit from church and from the car ride into the afternoon, whatever I'm doing, into my family life, which is rarely silent these days. As we seek to bring silence into our daily lives, We must not forget the difference between the letter of silence and the spirit of silence. Joseph Dispenza makes a distinction between these, the letter of silence and the spirit of silence. He is a neuroscientist who at the age of 18 joined a monastery and lived there for 8 years. And the first year in the monastery was a time of intense training in spiritual discipline. He writes about what happens when he tells people that he spent an entire year in complete silence. They stop cold and their eyes seem to ask, how could anyone live in silence for a year? Even if that were possible, why would anyone want to do it? But in that year, he discovered the difference between what he calls the letter and the spirit of silence. The letter of silence means not speaking at all, audibly or with sign language. You're silent, trying to quiet yourself within, but also careful not to intrude on the silence of others. This is very difficult to sustain, even in a monastery where everyone is engaging in this same practice. He strived to dwell in the inner spiritual world of silence as much as possible that year, but it didn't mean that he couldn't speak at all. Practicing the spirit of silence allowed him to speak when necessary. He spoke during prayer, in his classes, to his spiritual director, as well as to his dentist about a toothache. But none of this broke the spirit of silence. We enter this sanctuary to discover anew the spirit of silence so that we can practice it when we're not at church. We enthusiastically greet our neighbors and we sing hymns and we pause for silence and prayer. In the silence, we hear the still small voice of wonder and love. We hear it because we feel it. We reflect on our lives and what is most important to us, experiencing ourselves as connected to a larger web of life. We're here to build a community in which all people may grow in harmony with the divine. So now we can count to 12 and keep still. Let the silence remain with you and take this stillness into the heart of your lives as a spiritual practice. Count to 12 or 30 or longer. Hear the still small voice emerge. Know that you are loved and share this love with others. Blessings in your practice, and amen.